Announced policy of January 6, 2015. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the minority leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of this special order.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the California Democratic Congressional Delegation to honor the life of Don Edwards, who passed away earlier this month at the age of 100 in his home in Carmel. Congressman Don Edwards was someone I was proud to know for many years. He was born in San Jose, California in 1915, growing up on South 13th Street. Living in San Jose at an idyllic time, he took the trolley to play golf as a young man, attended public schools in San Jose, and received his bachelor's degree from Stanford University, where he later studied law and was admitted to the Bar Association of California in 1940. He became an FBI agent during the Depression. He used to talk about his service as an FBI agent, which he jokingly referred to as long hours looking for auto thieves in Indianapolis. But in fact, he served with great distinction in the FBI, and he went on to serve in the United States Navy as an intelligence officer and a gunnery officer in World War II. He was first elected to represent what was then California's 9th Congressional District in 1962, and he served for 32 years until January 3rd, 1995. I remember the first time I saw Congressman Don Edwards. It was before he was a congressman. He was giving a speech in Mitchell Park in Palo Alto, California. I was just out of elementary school, and I remember how impressed I was and inspired I was by his words. He, in turn, had been inspired by President Kennedy to run for Congress, and he was successfully elected that year. Over the years, he represented such communities as San Jose, Gilroy, Morgan Hill, parts of Milpitas, Fremont, Union City. He served on the Judiciary Committee and served as chairman of the House Subcommittee on Civil Liberties and Civil Rights for 23 years. He also sat on the Veterans Affairs Committee. Now, Congressman Don Edwards was one of the foremost defenders of civil liberties in Congress. In the 1970s, along with Senator Frank Church and his committee, they exposed the pervasive abuses of civil liberties in J. Edgar Hoover's COINTELPRO, which monitored, infiltrated, and disrupted entirely lawful civil rights and anti-war organizations. And his stature as a former FBI agent really allowed him to be effective in this role. In his first year in the House, he voted to abolish the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he was involved every year. And in fact, I helped him in the early 70s in trying to abolish HUAC. He finally succeeded in 1975. He was involved in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He was a dignified and important member of the House Judiciary Committee during the consideration of the impeachment of Richard Nixon. And he was known throughout the country as somebody who stood up for the Constitution. Earlier today, former Congresswoman Elizabeth Holtzman came on the floor, and we were talking that former members have the right to be present on the floor, but they do not have the right to address the Congress as a former member. But she wanted everyone to know that she was so proud that she was able to serve with Congressman Edwards on the Judiciary Committee, and she is not alone, or people who were able to serve with him. His contributions will live on for many generations, as demonstrated by the Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge, which was the first urban national wildlife refuge in the United States. And I remember he used to call the chairman of the committee in the 70s every single morning saying, "Where is my wildlife refuge?" Because such endangered species as the California clapper rail and the saltwater harvest marsh mouse were on the verge of extinction, and now they are not because of his work. As I said, he was a stalwart defender of the Constitution, a tireless advocate for the rights of women, and was known as the father of the Equal Rights Amendment, which he introduced every year. Congressman Edwards was also known as a champion of civil rights. After becoming chairman of the Subcommittee on Civil and Constitutional Rights, then known as Subcommittee Number 4, he managed the Equal Rights Amendment on the House floor in 1971, the extension of the Voting Rights Act in 1982, and all other civil rights bills of the era. Now, outside of Congress, he took part in civil rights marches in the South. His son, Len, was a freedom rider, and he joined Len Edwards during the Mississippi summer. He visited Dr. Martin Luther King when Dr. King was imprisoned in the Birmingham, Alabama jail, and Don Edwards spoke out against apartheid while visiting South Africa. Congressman Don Edwards had a long, fulfilling life, and part of that fulfillment was his marriage to Edie Wilkie Edwards until her death in April of 2011. She and he were very involved in a group that no longer is active in the House called Members of Congress for Peace Through Law, because they were people who believed that we could have a peaceful world and the route to peace was the rule of law. Congressman Edwards is survived by 4 sons, Len Edwards, Samuel, Bruce, and Thomas, as well as 4 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. He died peacefully and with a great deal of grace, according to his son, Len Edwards, and I quote, "He died as he lived, an elegant man." He leaves a legacy of supporting civil rights, advocating for those less fortunate in our society, and as being a strong defender of our Constitution. In fact, in his district, they used to call him not the congressman from the 10th Congressional District, but the congressman from the Constitution. I'm fortunate that when I graduated from college in 1970, I came to Washington without a job. I walked into his office, and he hired me. And I worked for him for nearly 9 years, both here in Washington and in his district in San Jose. He helped me enormously by giving me time off to take exams while I was taking my law school classes. He helped me and mentored me, and I feel a great debt of gratitude to him personally for all he did to help me, but mainly to inspire me and a whole generation of Americans to believe in their country and to believe in their Constitution and to believe in the rule of law and civil rights. And with that, I would yield 5 minutes to my colleague, the gentleman from California, Mr. Sam Farr.
Thank you very much for yielding, Zoe Lofgren, the chair of our wonderful California delegation, the largest Democratic delegation in Congress. When I arrived in Congress in a special election in 1993, Don Edwards was the dean, the chair of the Democratic delegation, the same delegation that his former employee, Zoe Lofgren, Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, now holds. He was the father figure for all of us from California, and I think from this entire Congress, when you look at his remarkable record. It's ironic that Don Edwards grew up in a Republican family in the Stanford area in Santa Clara Valley, attended Stanford University, was president or captain of the golf team, did very well in golf, and so much so that the district that I represent every year hosts what was formerly known as the Crosby Clambake, now the AT&T Pro-Am Golf Tournament. And Don Edwards told me that he carried his pro. He got a better score than his pro. And they won the tournament, the first tournament, first Clambake at Pebble Beach. He soon became president of the Young Republicans, and quickly thereafter left the Young Republicans and became a very, very liberal Democrat. I asked him once, as he retired, as Congressman Lofgren said, to Carmel, California. He retired to a home right next to the home that I grew up in and my sister still lives in. So we had many, many nights with he and Edie discussing politics. And I once asked him, what made you become a Democrat? And he said, well, you know, Sam, after I got out of Stanford, I was in the FBI, and right after law school. And after I knew what the government could do to you through the FBI, I decided that I'd better be on the other side to protect the rights of individuals. He then became a Navy intelligence officer. One of the things that happened when he left the FBI was no fan of the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and he asked Congress to audit the FBI. Well, that FBI had never been audited. All of the seizure of the equipment and goods and things that they had taken in their arrests were used to support them internally, and people thought there might be some foul play there. Because he asked for that audit, he was on their blacklist. A former FBI agent knew a little bit too much about what was going on inside the FBI and with J. Edgar Hoover. He as a member of Congress, and it's really interesting, he got elected when John F. Kennedy was president, and he left Congress when Bill Clinton was president. So all of those presidents between Kennedy and Clinton, Don Edwards had served with. If anybody, he was probably the most dapper, best dressed, politest, nicest human being on this floor. He had great friends on the Republican side of the aisle, even though he was such a liberal member of the Democratic Party. One of his friends was Hamilton Fish from New York, and they worked together on many of these remarkable acts: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He became chair of the subcommittee on civil and constitutional rights, and he managed the Equal Rights Amendment on the House floor. He was a constitutional, civil rights, human rights expert, and passionate about his feelings to law to protect people. When Don and Edie retired to Carmel, California, they brought with them a lot of their friends from Washington and in his home state of California, and we used to have wonderful dinner parties together. He was still a member of Cypress Point Golf Club, a very exclusive golf club. In fact, he was the longest surviving member of that club. And unfortunately, Edie predeceased him, his wonderful wife for many years that we all loved, and were saddened about her development of lung cancer, and she died. And Don wanted to have a memorial service for her at a local church, and then the reception at the Cypress Point Golf Club, one of the most conservative golf clubs in the United States. Don was very proud after the church service to have invited everybody, and he proudly stated that this was the largest collection of Democrats that had ever been at Cypress Point Country Club. He had a great sense of humor, lots of friends, remarkable human being, able to work across the aisle, something we miss today. And with that, he was able to accomplish some of the greatest laws of this country in modern era. A good friend of Republicans and Democrats, but most of all, the friends of the animals and the people who can less speak for themselves. We will sorely miss this great man who served this great institution for a long, long time. And my wife sends all her best. She was at his bedside when he died, and she was part of his caretaking team. We will have services for him in Carmel this Sunday, and there will be services in the San Jose area and future services here in Washington. So I just stand tonight to give you my thoughts on my relationship with great man Don Edwards, who championed civil rights and died at the age of 100. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Sam Farr. I'd now like to yield to the gentlelady from San Francisco, Ms. Pelosi, such time as she may consume.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, the chair of the House Democrats of California, for calling us together on the special order to honor a truly great man. I want to associate myself with the remarks that have gone before and to say to Sam Farr, thank you to you and to Sherry for the love and affection and care that you gave not only to Don Edwards but to Edie Wilkie for such a long time. We all talked about how much we loved them. You were there for them all the time, and we're completely, entirely in your debt. Thank you for the love that you gave them. And thank you again, Zoe, and the entire California delegation for orchestrating this special order hour. Tonight, Mr. Speaker, we honor an august statesman who labored with dignity, led with integrity, and lived with courage. Congressman his real name, William Donlin, otherwise known as Don Edwards, who passed away last month at the age of 100 years old. His life was a gift to the nation. He protected our communities through his service as an FBI agent. He protected our country through his service in the U.S. Navy during World War II. He moved our country forward through his service as a U.S. Congressman. Service, leadership, patriotism. Don Edwards. Don reminded us that how we live our values matters. So he fought for fair pay, becoming the father of the Equal Rights Amendment. He stood with the Freedom Riders at a time when they were written off as troublemakers and agitators. He championed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and fought to protect freedom of speech. He spoke up for workers, for our environment, for the resources needed to improve our country and for the future and for future generations. As chair of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil and Constitutional Rights for more than 20 years, Don became the conscience of the Congress and strived to ensure that all Americans enjoyed equality of opportunity. He took great pride in the fact that he was the floor leader for the Equal Rights Amendment, that he managed that bill. During his 32 years in the House, Congressman Edwards helped change the course of history. So significant was his leadership. Oddly enough, Don won his first election to any office in 1950 when he was elected president of the California Young Republicans. Throughout his life, Don's ability to respect all viewpoints made him a remarkable leader, respected by members on both sides of the aisle. When he was 88 years old, Don reminded us that the world works better when we get along, and that's what we owe everybody. In California, we hold a special place of honor for Congressman Edwards, the longtime dean of the California Democratic delegation. The beautiful, pristine Don Edwards San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge serves as a tribute to his efforts to preserve our environment and our ideals for future generations. In fact, he, as a modern-day man and a member of Congress, with his love of nature and all living things, was probably as close to a model of St. Francis of Assisi as we have ever seen. Don Edwards, a gentle, beautiful man. Don Edwards never stopped serving our country, and his achievements will stand forever as a living monument to his determined vision and legendary ability. But it wasn't just about that. It's how he encouraged others. I can tell you, as when I came to Congress 28 years ago, there were only 23 women in the House out of 435, 12 Democrats, 11 Republicans. To say that we weren't always paid full attention to would sound almost complaining, but it was a fact. Nobody ever asked you, what do you think, to any of the women members. I mean, we made our voices heard, of course, but nobody ever said, what do you think? Except Don Edwards. Don Edwards would say, what do you think of this, to each of us? especially when he was dealing with issues that related directly to us, but even well beyond that, whether we were talking about national security, economic growth, whatever the subject, Don would always say to us, "What do you think?" Well, I can remember hearing him say, "Nancy, what do you think?" And I said, "Don, do you know how unusual that is to hear you say that?" And he'd say, "Why do you say that?" I said, "Because not many people around here, of the 400 and something versus the 23, come up and ask the few of us who are here, the few women who are here, what we think." But he was always about encouraging people to reach their fulfillment and to see what their contribution could do for the common good. Sadly, we lost Edie Welke a few years ago. As Sam Farr mentioned, she predeceased Don by a number of years. He worshipped Edie, and they were a real team for equality, for peace, for disarmament, for protecting the environment, for promoting opportunity and fairness. They were such a team. So I hope it is a comfort to his children, his grandchildren, all he loved them, that so many people throughout the world, certainly in our country, mourn the loss of a consummate public servant, proud Californian and proud American. May his legacy long endure in this House, and may it challenge all of us to do more and do better on behalf of America's working families. Thank you again, Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, for bringing us together.
Thank you, Madam Leader. And it is wonderful to be able to, for those who served with Don Edwards and those who knew him by reputation, those who worked for him.
Would you yield for just one moment?
I would certainly yield.
I would like to say how proud he was and thrilled he was that Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren was going to succeed him in the Congress. He made that well known to all of us. So his service continues, his leadership, and your excellent service and leadership in the Congress.
Thank you, Madam Leader. And now I would like to turn to my colleague from California who was able to serve with Congressman Edwards for first 2 years of her service here in the Congress, and that would be Congresswoman Anna Eshoo for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentlewoman from California, the chair of the California Democratic Delegation, my dear friend and colleague. It's really, I think it's bittersweet this evening because we loved Congressman Don Edwards so much, and it's hard to imagine the world without him. He was the kind of human being that you wanted to have live forever. Instead, his contributions to our nation, to the state of California, to his community, that is a record that will be revered for generations and generations and generations to come. There is a lot that's already been said about Don, beautiful things that have been said about Don, how he graduated from Stanford University, the law school, how he began his professional career as an FBI agent, and how he joined the Navy as an intelligence officer. So he served our country in many different roles. And of course, the crown of his public service career was right here in the House of the People. The House of Representatives. He was a small businessman, a business that his father owned and that he became part of during the 1950s. And then, of course, he was elected as a Democrat. In fact, I still have in my office an invitation that Don had sent out. I think it must have been for some fundraiser that he had. But the cover of that invitation has Don Edwards standing next to a very young president of the United States, John F. Kennedy. and young children and those that helped elect John F. Kennedy and anyone else that comes through my office very often remark about the picture. It's something that I cherish, my staff cherishes, and my constituents do. It's been said that he was elected to be the president of the California Young Republicans. It's a very prestigious organization, and I can just see Don elegant in every way. He dressed magnificently. He had the most beautiful posture, the way he carried himself. He almost kind of glided down the hall. But he had a deep sense of humility about himself. We talk about his greatness and his goodness, and he was never one to want to be served. His joy was in serving. And so he had more than a healthy dose of humility about him. Don Edwards had an eloquence about him that ran as deep as his beliefs. In my lifetime, he had two great love affairs. One was Edie, and the other was the Constitution. He loved the flag. He understood that that was a symbol of our country. But he knew that the Constitution, our Constitution, was the soul of our nation. And that's where he embedded himself. In the Constitution, in that subcommittee that did its work to always reinforce and establish the constitutionality and make the Constitution live for people who it had not touched yet. If there is anything that would be noble, I think that is. And the record that he built was one where he was the foremost champion of civil rights, having drafted every civil rights bill in the House of Representatives for 2 decades. What a record. What a magnificent record. He loved his community. I remember when he announced that he was retiring, he thanked his constituents for the patience that they had extended to him. Because I think many times in the debate about what is constitutional and how to extend rights to people is not always very popular in the beginning. We love our history once it's been made, but we struggle very hard and don't always recognize the opportunity at hand that history is being made. And in his gentle, elegant way, he thanked his constituents for the patience that they had with him, and that they stayed with him so that he could do the work that he did on their behalf. He famously said of the 1982 extension of the Voting Rights Act, if you can't vote, you're not a real citizen. So he understood where the nub of the dignity of citizenship rested. Voting. I don't think he could really comprehend why the Voting Rights Act is not being brought up today, and so that we can all vote on it and improve what is so essential in the life of citizens of our country. I think, Mr. Speaker, that Congressman Edwards would be very proud of his colleagues in the California Democratic delegation today, starting with our chair, Zoe Lofgren, who not only works side by side with him, but now chairs our delegation. And that the values that he carried, the values that he loved and that he made so real and shared with everyone in the House, whether colleagues agreed or disagreed with him, they drew a great sense of joy from him, because they knew the love of our Constitution and of our country that he carried. And so they respected him. And what he carried and did here, I think he'd be very proud of his fellow Californians for carrying those traditions on. I want to pay tribute especially to Sherry Farr, Congressman Sam Farr's wife, who, as I said to Sherry, because she was there when Don took his last breath, I feel that we were all there with him because she was. She did so much in seeing to the great care that was given to him until he took his last breath. There's a poet that wrote, "And so he passed on, and all the trumpets sounded on the other side." God bless you, Don Edwards, for what you gave and created for our country. We bless your name, and we thank you for your service. It's an honor to honor you. And we love the Edwards family, and we always will. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Eshoo. You know, it's a small community that we have in Santa Clara County, even though we have millions of people who live in the region. But after Don Edwards was elected, there was a young mayor called Norm Mineta who wanted to run for Congress, and we went to the max trying to help Norm Mineta be elected to Congress, and he ultimately was. And later, Norm Mineta helped a young fellow to the max get elected, and we were so proud that that young legislator was also successful in being elected to Congress, actually in the seat that overlapped that was formerly Norm Mineta's seat. So I would like to yield to the gentleman, my colleague in Santa Clara County and also Southern Alameda County, Congressman Mike Honda.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Zolofgren. And I just want to thank you for us putting this event together this evening. And tonight we heard many words described by folks who have known Don Edwards personally in work and part of his life. We're here tonight to honor my friend, Congressman Don Edwards, also a native of San Jose. Don was really a true statesman, the likes of which you don't find often these days. And today we work to further the modern progressive agenda that he believed in. But our work would not be possible without standing on the shoulders of giants such as Don Edwards, who came before us, and Don was one of those people that I stood upon his shoulders. When I first ran for Congress, I went to him and asked for his advice because I never had the opportunity to work with him, but I did work with his sons, and one especially, Len Edwards, who was a judge. And as a school person, I could see the kinds of impact that Don has had on his son, Len Edwards, who was a judge. And Len was the kind of guy that extended himself also as his dad. And he used to run truancy court in the school site that I was a principal of, which is really unique. And this is the kind of legacy that Don Edwards has left behind, a uniqueness of the kind of person that he was. Don was never afraid to take a stand if he knew it to be right. And at every turn, he stood up for what he believed in. When I ran for Congress, I asked him for his advice. And he just very comfortably looked at me and said, just do the right thing. And I think that here in Congress, we often are challenged to do the right thing and not the political thing. And sometimes to do the right thing, it means to stand in the face of popular winds, knowing that you're doing the right thing in spite of the fact that other folks, other dynamics are trying to move the ship in another direction. He was the kind of person that was really stalwart, a true champion of civil and constitutional rights in his nearly 3 decades of Congress. And in 1963, in his first year in Congress, he voted to abolish the House Committee on Un-American Activities. He went on to be the champion of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And as early as 1972 was effectively working to protect our environment, authoring a bill to establish the National Wildlife Refuge in San Francisco Bay. And although he was a self-described liberal Democrat, Congressman Edwards consistently worked across the aisle, including the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which bolstered employees' rights. Because of his fearlessness today, we are able to work for a more progressive change. And because of his leadership and his modeling, I've been able to use him as my compass in making the right decisions and understanding to do the right thing. We have to stand up to fear-mongering and seek to ensure that all people are free of fear of bullying, persecution, racism, and sexism. And we talk today about equality for women and the need for equal pay for equal work. And as an educator myself and a principal of over 30 years, I'm really grateful for the legacy that Don left in the field of education. Himself a product of California public schools, he started the conversation that I now proudly bring my voice to, and that is the need to preserve the civil and constitutional rights for all people. And I know that he agreed that education is also a civil right, and we must find a path to a quality education that is equitable for each and every child. I thank my friend and colleague, Congresswoman Lofgren, for hosting again this special order. And it's been said of her experiences and her life experiences entwined with Congressman Don Edwards. And she knew Don better than most of us, and not only was the one of his staffers, but she went on to hold his seat in Congress, as it was said before. And I think that Don would look upon her work and her leadership and her stalwartness and say, she's doing the right thing, she's doing the right way, and she's a person of conscience. And I think that would make him very proud. You know, not long ago, I was incredibly honored to have someone tell me that I come from a place of fairness and equality. And that's our area. That's the area that all of us represent. Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, Zoe Lofgren, Leader Pelosi, myself, and others. And Congresswoman Lofgren has said once that Congressman Edwards had a tremendous sense of fair play. It is my hope that together my colleagues and I can honor his legacy, not just tonight, but as we approach our work. When we stand up for religious liberties, true equality for women, for American workers, I think Don might look down and smile upon the kind of work that we're attempting to do. I learned one thing also from Don Edwards, the importance of giving voice to those who don't have one. It was mentioned that Norman Etta was one of the folks that Don Edwards has maxed out for. And when Norman Etta was leading the effort to pass the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, Don Edwards was right there with him to make sure that the mistake that this country had foisted upon Americans of Japanese descent in 1942, that his work, along with Norman Etta and his leadership, along with Norman Etta, they were able to be successful in the 100th Congress, passing H.R. 442, which was signed into law by President Reagan. And that was done because there was an intense understanding of the Constitution and the violation of the Constitution back in 1942 that our government had consciously foisted upon 120,000 members of its own country. And so that effort took over 10 years here in Congress. So it's persistence and an understanding that to do the right thing, sometimes it takes persistence and educating other people who would not otherwise have thought about what happened in 1942. So I'm here because of that work. I'm here because of that tremendous effort to make sure that people of different backgrounds, although they may look different, have different religions, different upbringing, different language, different culture, different foods, that they also are accepted as Americans. And he gave voice to us, and that voice allowed us to be able to become participating members of this Congress. And so in that modeling, when folks in my own district come up to me and say, we know that you didn't have a voice, and someone gave you a voice afterwards. We need a voice in Congress also. So that sort of led me to understand to move in the same direction that Don Edwards would want us to do, and to create be a voice for those who don't have a voice. For the Ethiopian community, we became a voice. For the Sikh community, we became a voice. For the Muslim community, we became a voice. For those who have been bullying on day in and day out because of who they are, we became a voice. And this is the legacy that Don Edwards has left with us. And it's an unfinished business that we need to continue to move forward on. But it was because of his consciousness, his leadership, his firm belief in doing the right thing, every instance, in spite of the fact that it may not be popular at the moment, it is constitutional. And so I just want to end with thanking my friend Congresswoman Lofgren for hosting this hour. And I am truly honored and privileged to stand here today and pay tribute to long legacy of our friend, Don Edwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Honda, for that statement and for your leadership and following the example of Don Edwards. You know, when Don Edwards announced he was going to retire after 32 years in the Congress, I called him and I heard a rumor that he was thinking. I begged him not to do it, that we needed him in the Congress, and he said, there are some new guys on the Judiciary Committee. You don't have to worry about civil rights and civil liberties because they're in good hands. And one of those people was Bobby Scott, who I yield to now for as much time as he may consume.
Well, thank you, and I thank you for yielding and the opportunity to speak in honor of the recently departed Congressman William Donellan Don Edwards, a civil rights champion, supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment, defender of the Constitution. And I'm proud to say that as a freshman in college, I had the honor to serve with Congressman Edwards on the Judiciary Committee. And I'd just like to say a few words about his work on that committee. Congressman Edwards was the living embodiment of the phrase equal justice under law. The words etched above the main entrance of the United States Supreme Court building. When he arrived at Congress in 1963, he noted, and I quote, 11 states in the Old South practiced apartheid. There was the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the FBI was out of control, threatening individual liberties. And as a freshman, he wasted no time adapting to his new role in Congress because he recalled that when he arrived on Capitol Hill, black people couldn't vote in large parts of the country, and if they did, they'd get hanged. After visiting the American South, where his son Leonard worked to register African Americans to vote, he wrote a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King telling him that he understood the absolute necessity for the immediate passage of the Civil Rights Act, and that he told Dr. King that we stand ready to support your efforts here in Washington. With that, he proceeded to work to secure the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He rose quickly to the rank of chairman of the House Subcommittee on Civil and Constitutional Rights in 1971. In that capacity, he took on major issues, such as the Equal Rights Amendment, which fell just 3 states short of ratification. Congressman Edwards said that it is the irresistible impulse of government to assume more power. My role has been to say no. That statement perfectly captures his drive to eliminate the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1975 and his disapproval of President Nixon's unauthorized use of government agencies to harass political opponents. Congressman Edwards worked tirelessly to gain the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the Fair Housing Amendments Act, and the Civil Rights Act of 1991. He successfully fought to extend the Voting Rights Act of 1982 over the objections of President Reagan, who wanted to end the Justice Department's pre-clearance power. At the time, Congressman Edwards said simply, if you can't vote, you're not a real citizen. Unfortunately, in 2013, the Supreme Court essentially struck down the Justice Department's pre-clearance powers under the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County v. Holder decision. When Congressman Edwards retired in 1994, the late Republican congressman and former chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Henry Hyde, said this of Congressman Edwards: "He is relentlessly liberal, but that's not a vice. The battle for the fullest expression of civil liberties is losing a general, not a foot soldier." Mr. Speaker, I was honored to serve, although briefly, with this great general who battled for equal justice and equal rights. Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentlelady from California for giving me this opportunity, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Congressman Scott, for those wonderful words. We have quite a number of California members, as well as others, who've asked for their statements to be put in the record as our time is expiring at this point. But I just would like to make a couple of final comments. We've talked about Don Edwards' legislative record, but it really was rooted in his values. He was someone who cared about people who didn't have enough. And when he rewrote the Bankruptcy Act, he was thinking about working people who couldn't actually make ends meet. When the service workers in the House were laid off every time the House recessed, and without any ability to actually have a paycheck, the one person they sought for help was Congressman Don Edwards. I remember lobbyists came in to lobby in favor of discrimination against women. And I was on his staff, and he said, well, let me call in the young lawyer I rely on for this. And when I walked in, that was sort of the end of the conversation. He lived a long time. He changed this world for the better. We loved him greatly. The fact that so many people went out to California to help him, former staffers, people like Jim Copeland and Debbie McFarland, who actually went out to make sure he had what he needed, was tribute to the kind of person he was. And has been mentioned, he was very liberal, but he got along with people who were very conservative. And I remember he and Henry Hyde, as ranking member, got along quite well and had a great deal of respect for each other. So at this point, I would just like to say that we miss Don Edwards. We honor his life and contributions. We know that we cannot mourn him for his 100 years. He made a difference. He made our country better, and we love him for it. And I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.